even wondering there would be less disruption if a few of you who are way in the back would take the closest seats in. People wondering there are seats for them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 seats in the front right now. Everybody bold enough?
But I think sort of this more general point was interesting. You got the wrong answer. Wait for it back. Yeah. Yeah. And he's obviously a bit more skeptical in some ways than I kind of realized. Yeah, I hadn't really known that. I didn't even know that, but that was kind of interesting. It was so funny. I was literally, I spent 15 minutes Googling, thinking, who's his favorite person as a person? I don't know. Yeah. Right. He said he might come to this
I don't know if any of you were in the audience on Alumni Day in May, when a climate event was scheduled, Michael McCracken, whose 50th reunion it was one of the stars. I was chairing then, as I am now. I'm Robert Socolow from the School of Engineering and PEI. The room was chosen by the Alumni Council. It was over in the Architecture 101. And it was bursting its seams. And I said then that it's a bit like climate change. Try to plan, you have no plan B. We have no plan B, so there's going to be a very crowded room. I hope everyone will fit. There's still one seat on the first row. So today we are both celebrating and being sober. We're celebrating, first of all, the institution called the IPCC, which has completed its 5th round of reports, roughly 5 years in the making in each case. So an institution that has lasted 25 years, has won a Nobel Prize along the way, and has been a remarkable institutional invention that has brought together scientists of various types from the entire world, who managed to compromise their differences and come out with final reports, approximately 1,000 pages apiece, 3 reports each cycle. We are celebrating 3 individuals who are our speakers, each one of whom has been a very prominent player in the IPCC, and not entirely by accident, one in each of the 3 reports. Ramaswamy, who is the head of the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab, has been a leader in the actual production of the reports, in the planning of the reports, in the science section, which is Working Group 1, Climate Science. Michael Oppenheimer, I think since the very inception of IPCC, has been involved in discussions of why we care about climate change. What are the impacts that make a difference to us? How to express those. And Marc Fleurbaey, a relative newcomer to that group, I believe, has been one of the most thoughtful people questioning the way in which Working Group 3, which is what we might do about the problem, that goes about its work. There's a dominant methodology, as you will hear from Marc in a moment, that is nominally value-free, in fact, far from it, and Marc is exploring the implications of making values more transparent. The soberness is because there is a restlessness in all 3 of these communities that produce these reports about AR6, the 6th assessment report, which is being planned now, which would produce reports approximately in 2020, 2021. Should it be more of the same? Is it possible institutionally to make a sharp turn in any direction, and if so, what directions would be valuable. This is actually the 1 year, perhaps, in which that discussion can be truly open-ended and imaginative, and good ideas have a chance. After that, things will get locked in as they have in every previous cycle. So this is a very important time, and all three of our speakers will address possibilities and potentialities for the IPCC in round 6. All of them are interested in what will be the common theme today, the relation of science and government. These reports are, the summaries of these reports are actually negotiated between the scientists and the policymakers from close to 200 countries for about a week, and a remarkable set of compromises have happened. And there was a very interesting discussion of that process in Nature. Was it Nature or Science, Mark? Nature. Science. Science. In Science. And Marc was one of the main contributors to it. The issue there was there is a trade-off between being engaged and being pure, being influential and being independent on the part of the academic community, and the academic community through various representatives, Marc included, debated that point. So Marc is our first. We will not do in the order of the working groups. Rather, we will start with Marc, who has been on the record on this very interesting subject. Marc has a joint appointment in the Woodrow Wilson School and the Center for Human Values, and he is a recent arrival from Paris. By university standards, we're less than 5 years, but he's recent. And he continues to have a research group there. He'll be followed by Michael Oppenheimer, professor in the Woodrow Wilson School of Ocean and Environmental.
All very well.
Correct. We'll be followed by Ramaswamy, who is, as I said already, the director of the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory and a lecturer in the Department of Geosciences. And then by Michael Oppenheimer, who is in the Woodrow Wilson School, the Department of Geosciences, and the Princeton Institute. Marc, the floor is yours.
Rob will probably explain a bit more later that this is part of a series of seminars that are happening this semester.
Why don't you say?
So we are launching a group that is a follow-up to a previous group that was about the problem of communicating scientific uncertainty. Now we are focusing this group on the issue of how to frame the analysis of the climate problem. So it's called the Climate Futures Initiative, and it's run by Melissa Lane from the Center for Human Values here in the Politics Department, and Rob Socolow and myself. And we have two series of seminars. This one is the sort of broad audience seminar, and the other is more for technically oriented people on integrated assessment modeling. So now, let me briefly, I try to speak very briefly, but I'd like just to give you how I understand the three pieces that were distributed that are in the science issue on this, and it's a sort of debate, but I'm not sure that we should read them as being opposed. They are actually proposing different attitudes, and these attitudes are not mutually exclusive. So one attitude is to worry about the potential of political interference with the scientific message, and especially you may have heard in the media that the approval session of the summary for policymakers for Working Group 3 has been an eventful and a bit stormy event, and so there's been some discussion about whether we should rethink the process in light of what happened. So if you worry more about this idea of political interference, the suggestion that you would make for the process, for the IPCC process, would be to highlight the technical parts of the report and somehow downplay the part, the summary for policymakers, that has to go through this kind of negotiation with the delegates of the government. The other point that is made in another piece, the one I co-signed, is that there is actually something interesting happening when there is a discussion with governments, which is something that forces the authors, the experts, to be aware of the political undertones of what they are doing. and also to understand that the relative weight of different issues or different perspectives is not something that is totally obvious. So there may be a difference here between working group 1, which is really about climate science, and working groups 2 and 3, which are more about policy and especially economic policy. When you talk about socio-economic policy, indeed, it's very hard to just focus on science as something that is separate from political debates. And therefore, the suggestion here in terms of how to improve the process is perhaps to try to avoid a very last hour confrontation with the policymakers and to rethink the coordination, the discussion with them earlier on, so that their sensitiveness to some issues or some formulations can be taken on board early enough by the authors. The last piece in the science debate is something that reflects a point that was quite important in working group 3, an attitude that was that we should try to be, the mantra was policy relevant but not policy prescriptive, and the idea was to clearly distinguish facts and values and explain the different values, the array of values that could be relevant without endorsing them directly. So as to somehow propose a menu of values from which the policymakers could choose. The terminology that is used by the authors, Otmar Edenhofer was a co-chair of Working Group 3, was to consider the policymakers are the navigators and the experts are the map makers. So they show the map and the road is chosen, the route is chosen by the policymakers. I'm not quite sure exactly whether this third piece suggests something in terms of the process. I don't really make a proposal about how to change the process or to change the way we deal with various pieces of the report. So what I'll do in the remaining time that I have, and try really to be short, is just to give you a few examples of what happened in Working Group 3, so that the discussion is a bit more concrete and less abstract about process in general. So one section of the summary for policymakers was about the first chapters of this Working Group 3 report, which were so-called framing chapters, which describe the decision criteria, the values, the various philosophical approaches that you could have when dealing with climate policy. And it was a kind of innovation in this report to give so much weight to a description of philosophy, so to speak. And there were real philosophers in Working Group 3, which was quite unusual. And so people were very proud to have some philosophers in the group. And but this section that was summarizing the framing chapters was really in jeopardy. We heard some delegates saying that this section was totally useless. And so there was an issue about whether we could save this section and whether it could be helpful in some way. So what happened actually was that this section was expanded. So in a way it was lucky. And part of the reason for that is that we had a contact group, so it was a separate group of the smaller number of people working on it, a smaller group of experts and of delegates. And we worked almost day and night for 4 days on 1.5 pages or something like that. And my personal impression is that the section was actually improved by the process. But not everything was simple. And let me give you a few examples. So the small text that you have here are excerpts from the summary for policymakers, from that section. And let me just briefly, I won't read that, but let me briefly explain what happened. So the expression global commons, when we talk about the climate problem as a global commons problem, that appeared to be very touchy. And the expression was rejected outright by some delegates. And we managed to save it because we believed it was an important element of correctly characterizing the situation in order to better understand how to frame the policy issue. And we managed to save it first by putting it in a footnote, which is not very glorious, but also by explaining more what this had, the meaning of this, and the fact that it didn't have direct political implications, and especially didn't have legal implications. And so there could be a misunderstanding about what it means when you talk about commons. You could think of certain legal arrangements, and we had to explain that. So explaining was helpful here, and that illustrates the second attitude I was describing in the previous slide, if you have the occasion for dialogue and explanations, then things can go through. The same happened for equity weight. So the issue that when you do cost-benefit analysis or policy evaluation in general, you should take account of the distributional impacts. That was something that in the framing chapters was really highlighted, and many of the authors really wanted to convey that message, which is not so well received among practitioners of cost-benefit analysis, for instance. So it was a kind of interesting message to convey. And again, we had to explain more. We had to make it really precise what was the state of the art in the relevant domain. And then we could keep something that was initially quite reluctantly considered by delegates. There were other topics where things were not as easy, and equity in burden sharing was a bit of a difficult issue. And the formula that was retained is really very bland. And we couldn't really do the idea of showing the various, the array of principles that could be referred to in this context. So that appears in the report, of course, but it could not really be elevated to the summary. The right to development became an issue. So again, you could have a list of views about the right of peoples or individuals to attain a certain levels of a standard of living. Again, that was an issue that was very hard, and the formulation that ended up being accepted in the summary for policymakers almost doesn't make any sense. But that's what could be done, and there needed to be a compromise there. I mentioned compensation, so that's something that was not discussed, was not in any draft of the summary for policymakers, but in the report you have a description of the issue of reparation, compensatory justice, the legacy of what happened in the past towards certain peoples, and how to deal with that, and how to take into account this legacy in current policy. I heard in private from certain delegates that it was lucky that we didn't mention that because it would have never gone through. So there are issues like that that are discussed in the literature but are hard to. So you see, these are perhaps examples where the concern for the overreach of policymakers is indeed legitimate. There is an issue here of perhaps excessive veto on certain formulations. There is a second example that somehow confirms the importance of how the process is going. I won't get into the details of the substance, but the last section of the summary for policymakers was about international cooperation. And things went very badly in the approval session because this section was the last, so it was addressed. It was tackled at the end of the week. People were tired and exhausted and also not very happy about what happened before. I will tell you more. And so, because of this atmosphere, this section didn't really survive. Essentially, it was almost cut from the report. Now, in the synthesis report, there has also been an approval session, and the people in charge of this section, the topic was not the same section, of course, it's a different report. It's a synthesis report which covers all the three working groups. But the person in charge was careful enough to ask for having a contact group in the beginning of the approval session. And then the substance survived. So what happened for the previous section in Berlin could happen again with this section. So somehow it proved that enough time, enough preparation, enough dialogue, discussion between policymakers and experts can work, but it needs to be really arranged. The third example that has been the most contentious and has been discussed in the media has been the issue of country groupings, and in particular this figure, which showed that, so you have to look at the second and, let me see if I can show that. The second and the third curves here, which are the total emissions between 1970 and 2010 of the high-income countries, that's the upper curve, and the upper middle-income countries. And so the message that you can take from this figure is that, well, something should be done about sharing the burden of effort with the upper middle-income countries. It's no longer a matter just for the high-income countries. And you can, of course, you can say, well, but if you look at per capita emissions, things may look different. Well, they look a bit different, but you see, there is something happening again with the curve of the upper middle-income countries, and this is worrisome. And the issue here is how to deal with this problem. So things went badly at the approval session because these figures were just deleted from the summary for policymakers. And could it be managed differently? It's not totally obvious, but there have been, in the report itself, you find different groupings that suggest different reactions or different policy conclusions. There was this figure was in the chapter 5 of the report, and describes, again, the similar sort of things with the total emissions per different groupings here and the emissions per capita for the same groupings. And what you see there is a bit different because Asia appears here quite low, actually. And so here it's quite important, but compared to what we had before, it's not exactly the same. Now, if you look back at this figure, what happens here is only due to China. So there is a grouping that has never been discussed, and which is, you see, the figure on the left here is the figure that you have seen already, the one where we see these two curves merging. And this figure is based on a grouping that comes from the World Bank, and in which the year of the income of reference for grouping the countries is 2012, which is the very end of the period of study. Now you could say, why not take another period, which is another reference year, which is a bit more in the middle of the period, or, I mean, not in the middle, but slightly less toward an extreme. Actually, 2010 is outside of the period that is considered. So if you take 2009, what happens is that China is no longer in the upper middle income group. And so that completely changes the graph. So now you have the upper middle income countries here, and China, which was still in the lower middle income, carries the curve. Okay, so you see, the issue of groupings, so there has been a debate about whether the groupings were scientific or not, but whether I don't want to address that, but you see, it's a very delicate issue, and I guess we have to think about how to be careful about that. So here I put the curves of these countries, and for instance, you see that it's really China and not India. I've arranged that the curves are comparable in the vertical axis. You can look at the decomposition of the emissions in terms of the causes, whether it's population or growth or energy intensity, and you really see that what happens for Asia is growth. Growth is the driver of these increased emissions, and it's not so much a problem with the energy intensity, which was not bad at all. There is an interesting issue to consider, which is about leapfrogging. Here you have the situation of China, but perhaps I don't really have the time to explain this figure. This is GDP per capita here, and this is greenhouse gases per capita. And so you see that you have the path of China between, I think it's between 1970 and 2010, which is going in this direction. And you have, for instance, the US are over there. And so the interesting question is whether China is going to look like the US or will be below the US, so will somehow adopt a greener path. So it looks like it's going toward Japan, but who knows, right? So that's the kind of issue that has to be discussed. So you see, the debate there about the sensitiveness of the delegates and also of somehow the others was about whether China has to be identified as a sort of culprit for what was going on, and whether it has to be forced to make efforts to be taken on board for the group of countries making effort. Let me stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here talking about Working Group 1 perspective. I've been involved with Working Group 1 since the 1992 supplementary assessment report of the IPCC, and I've been through almost, well, not all of its plenaries of Working Group 1, but almost all of them but one. So let me start with some views based on my experience. So these are very much personal views, but I think they're probably shared by a lot of the working group one types, at least to those who went into the SPM drafting and the plenary session.
Remind people of the word SPM.
Summary for policymakers. Thank you, Rob. So summary for policymakers is sort of the apex point, if you will, of all the science that's done working with one, and likewise for working groups 2 and 3, the SPMs kind of collect everything at a high level, and this is the part of the document which governments actually have to approve for the entire report to be accepted by the governments. And the nature of this drafting, the reviews, and subsequently the plenary is such that this document has to be approved line by line. It's a document usually of about 10 to 15 pages, and every line has to be approved in the document for it to be officially accepted. So the governments have a big say in it, and the document is prepared. The working group one document, as Marc said, is kind of rests really mostly on the scientific platform prepared, but it has to be something that the governments have to accept. So in my view, and in a relative, in a comparative sense with the other two working groups, this document, the working group one draft that's received by the governments, tends to be well respected. And the scientific writing gets, I think, plenty of deference. Maybe sometimes it shouldn't get that much deference, but it does get a lot of deference and is accepted for the most part. And the policy entanglement with science is actually less dramatic than, for example, the cases that Marc showed, and there are lots of such cases in working groups 2 and 3. But there are exceptions, and I can recall 2 of them, which were very major ones. One was the second assessment, the 1995 report, which was the first one which brought out the, I have to paraphrase it, that human influences are discernible in the climate observations. And that was really contested by a few of the delegations, and it became actually a very big political affair. Of course, the statement was accepted, but it did create a big hullabaloo. The second one was something that I personally was involved with because I had actually formulated that statement. Was the fourth assessment. It was pretty innocuous in terms of the broader issue in climate change. It involved the statement that the natural forcings on the climate system, which is the changes due to solar irradiance and changes due to brought about the volcanic eruptions, exert an effect which is, I think, something like 10 times less than greenhouse gases. And 2 of the delegations contested very hotly. They kind of wanted it completely removed. And finally, they accepted a watered-down statement. And that was one instance where the science actually had to really come to a middle point. It wasn't that the science was turned on its head, but it was just that a stronger statement from the science was actually very effectively watered down by the government negotiations. It didn't alter the broader conclusions, but nevertheless it's an example where there was an entanglement with the scientific statement. So what I have seen is the balance between rational and governmental input sometimes can get policy prescriptive, and this is a challenge. It will not go away. In fact, as I'm going to come in the second part of some points, bullet points, that it's actually going to probably increase because of the nature of the problem and the nature of the reactions to the problem. From my own point of view, the relevance of the working of one science for decision making is imperative. So SPM has to continue to involve the scientists and the governments, even as scientists have the lead in the document. I think this is very important for the science to actually be relevant for decision-making purposes and for uses in working groups 2 and 3. I think there's an idea of the co-production of the working group 1 summary for policymakers. If it is co-produced right from the beginning, I think it runs the risk of undermining the basic idea that unbiased science, where scientists are presumably unbiased about what they are finding, actually provides a very good platform for decision-making and decision-making implementations. And so it runs the risk of impairing the credibility of the document if governments also get involved right at the beginning of writing science. And this has actually been, it has been tossed about from the beginning of every IPCC, and for working group 1 at least, it's been pretty, I think, firmly refuted. One of the things is that, which kind of hits at this point is that the scientific evidence that is judged robust by the experts, you just cannot disregard it for the convenience of expressing any policy prescription. And this is where sometimes it starts to get contentious in these meetings, but nevertheless, the experience in all the plenaries of some of the policymakers is that it doesn't have to be, and the nations by and large accept that you can have something removed, but you can't change the tenor of a statement, such as, if something is coming out with medium confidence by the scientist, you can't just, raise it to high or low at the SPM level, because the report will not bear it out. So let me go to the future now, because Rob asked us to think about AR6. So, there are some things that are going to be fairly well robust in terms of findings in the future assessments too. And one is just the warming and what it does. And it's kind of a given that there is going to be warming because the greenhouse gas scenarios are such that they are just going to keep on increasing. And moreover, if the one thing that has actually mitigated the effect of greenhouse gases, namely aerosol particles, if that is actually successfully removed from the atmosphere, you're going to get a double whammy, because not only are the greenhouse gases still there, you remove the one thing which is like a thermostat in the system, and so the warming is going to gallop up even more. The plot I picked to kind of depict this is a sea level rise, because that is really where the warming is going to have its, let's say, the most destructive and long-lasting impact, because it cannot go away quickly, because the carbon is going to be in the system, and you have a thermal inertia in the oceans. So this is something that I think you can be just assured that, that the numbers might change depending on the scenarios, but by 2100, the numbers that are being put up here are probably going to be pretty much the mean, or lying somewhere in the middle of the ranges of the scenarios. But I want to get to 3 issues which are actually going to, I think, be becoming more significant, in the sense that how to place confidence levels in them has actually been stymied because of, let's say, gaps in the understanding of the problem. And temperatures, you can sort of read every IPCC report. Very quantitative details are there, and confidence levels are there. Everything is pretty nice about temperatures in the projections of temperature in the future. Not so with precipitation. And this is as far as IPCC AR5 went. And actually, it's just a little bit more than where AR4 went, to answer the question of how large is the projected change due to internal variability, due to natural variability. And what you see in this plot very simply are stippled areas where the changes are large. So those areas happen to be the mid to higher latitudes. And then you have these hatched areas, stippled areas here. The hatched areas, which are mostly in the low latitudes. And you see those are areas where a lot of the population lives on this globe. And so, what is going to happen to precipitation, or how effectively the confidence levels can be ascribed to changes in precipitation, is going to become an important issue, because a lot of governments are actually concerned more about precipitation than they are about temperatures, particularly in tropical countries, because they're already hot. They know they're going to get hotter, okay, they live with it, but what about precipitation? Changes in patterns, drought situations, or excess precipitation situations. So that's going to be a troublesome area in the sense of where do governments come to an equilibrium on that. The other one is near-term projections. So we know what's going to happen in 2100 in the sense that all models give the same, and we don't have the 2100 observations yet, so it's very comfortable to say that you have to believe only the models. But the near term is a problem, because all of you have heard about the pause or the reduction in the rate of rise in global warming over this period, 1990 to 2010, kind of looks flat, but it's a reduction in the rate. And so the question is, let's say if we think about 2025, 2030, how's the curve going to go? Is it going to be like this, or is it going to be like this? This is a issue, because both mitigation and adaptation elements depend upon how the Earth system is going to evolve. And the fact that this kind of near flattening has happened in the last 20 years just does give pause to kind of the sense as to how rapidly are we going to walk. And I think this is something that is going to come up in a lot of questions in the next assessment AR6 by the government, would want to know exactly how to pace their mitigation and adaptation policies. The third item is the extremes. Okay, so I put the heat extremes example here. And this is a study done at GFDL using a model where, with a high resolution model, and which emphasizes regionality, you can actually try to predict the number of heat wave days per year relative to today. So the last column indicates in the various regions how many more heat waves days per year you will get relative to today. And you can see the numbers are anywhere from 3 to 4 to 6, so it will be 6 times, 5 times more.
Multiplying, not adding.
Multiplying, yes, it's multiplying, it's a ratio. So you multiply, so for example, in the Midwest, the number is 4, it means 4 times more heat wave days in a year. And this is already grabbing the attention of policymakers. I mean, this is actually more grabbing the attention than global mean temperatures, for obvious reasons. So, this is another issue that I think is going to bring in governments and scientists into making confidence statements, which are going to be very hotly contested, because it's been not easy to make confidence statements on this level, on regional scale, as it is on the global mean scale. So here's my final slide of what I think are going to be continuing issues in future assessments that involve science and policy, and therefore governmental inputs into this to a more assertive degree than has happened before. So I think that the question is already being asked: will confidence in projecting precipitation changes improve, since this affects the majority of the human populations as much as, if not more than, the warming that's occurring? And how do you treat the confidence in near-term projections, especially given the divergence between kind of the model projected rates of warming and what observations actually show the last 20 years? And in more particularly, how would the SPM, the future SPM, be affected by findings regarding the cause of the slowdown? I mean, is it natural? Is it some kind of forcing, anthropogenic forcing that we missed out on or we overestimated? Because that has then impact on the projections in the future too. And then occurrence and experience of climate extremes, together with the fact that now we have a growing knowledge of climate changes over subcontinental scales, due in part to observations, also due in part to much better computer models which can actually resolve these regions very well. And so now you're starting to get into everyone's backyard. So non-naturally, as you get into everyone's backyard, more and more people are interested in the problem. The more and more people are interested, the more and more the noise of words in the whole debate. And then the final thing is, there have been proposals from actually the 4th assessment and now after the 5th assessment about integrating some of the material in working group 1 along with working group 2 to actually maybe make a bridge between science and the impacts issues that IPCC should deal with. For example, climate, air quality, health is kind of one platform, if you will. Another plane is sea level rise and coastal ecosystems. And yet another one is droughts and extremes and so on. So, but in the future, it is possible that a lot of the working group 1 and 2 material gets dealt with at the working group level rather than separately coming up through 1 and 2. And Michael will be discussing working group 2 issues. But my question here would be, how would this affect the outcome in the preparation of the SPM? Because working group 2 involves impact, so it involves a lot of policy issues, it involves a lot more governmental inputs. And so that should be fun to watch as to how that gets integrated. It's going to be a really challenge. Okay, thank you very much.
If you were a DJ, what would you play after a tango?
So I agree with almost everything that was said in those 2 previous presentations, and I think it's a pretty accurate indication of what's going on in IPCC today. Let me add a few thoughts and then go into working group 2 in particular.
If anybody does not hear in the back, you have an obligation to tell us.
Yeah,
not
can
to
you
tell
hear?
us after the meeting, but now.
You cannot hear.
There's no amplification available.
I give up. Where's the microphone? With a lottery or anything? Should I
No,
just?
we can hear you fine.
No, he can't.
Come and sit down.
Now, when you talk to me, I can.
Hi, Lawrence.
You're fine, we're fine.
Okay, so let me just a few high-level messages. I've been involved with IPCC since the first assessment as an author in one form or another, and I've been involved in both Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 as an author. And I note there have been some marked changes over time. First of all, I think it's fair to say that IPCC is effective as long as you don't expect IPCC to be responsible for actually solving the climate problem. A lot of people blame IPCC for the fact that the problem, they say, can't IPCC fail because obviously nobody's listening. But that's kind of the deficit model of how science and policy interact, which is clearly wrong, namely that if things aren't happening the way you think they're supposed to, if people had more and clearer information, they would clearly make better decisions. This is a model which is long discredited. So you can't blame IPCC for that. Number two, IPCC has achieved, carved out a very large space in the assessment domain. I think it's at a kind of a sweet spot where it's not quite a monopoly, but it's clearly the first, the primary institution that the governments look to, and having that kind of solid a consensus by the governments on who they ought to listen to for information, so that there's a common reference point, is extremely important because we have this sort of very large, sprawling international negotiation that seems never to end, and they need that kind of reference point. But as Marc pointed out, you can't expunge values from much of what goes on in IPCC. That this is inevitable in Working Group 3, as Marc said. It's also inevitable, I'll argue, in Working Group 2, and to an extent which is smaller, as Ram, I'm sure, would agree, but still not expungible. Values creep into Working Group 1, and I'll show, you could go back to the slide Ram said, where there's a very nicely quantified way of indicating the likelihoods or the probabilities that things will or will not happen, and that's generally based on the range of model outcomes. And then there's a judgment superimposed upon that, which is the confidence judgment you saw on that last slide, a quantitative range of future sea level rise with a qualitative medium confidence on it. But that medium confidence embodies a whole bunch of unstated views, judgments, beliefs, and values about what counts and what doesn't count. And that's the part of it that IPCC is in some sense is unable to be explicit about, and yet it is fundamental in some way to not just Working Group 3 and 2, but also Working Group 1. Working Group 1 has done a very good job of trying to expand the space of judgments that are quantifiable and be explicit about those, but they've done a sort of less good job about being clear about the what you might call the subjective part of the judgments. So this is it's not necessarily a problem, it's just the way the business is done. The problem is that we're not very effective at being clear about the judgments we're making, what the nature of them is. And I think probably in the future we'll have to continue to get better at that. The bigger problem for IPCC, however, is that there's an increasing penetration of the concerns of the UNFCCC, the big negotiation, the political negotiation, into the IPCC process. We saw that. That was what went on. That was the problem with Working Group 3. That sounds like the problem that Ram just referred to in AR4. It certainly was the problem in the second assessment, the Ben Sander episode, and that you also referred to. And I saw it at the Working Group 2 plenary this time was very peaceful, especially in comparison to Working Group 3. There weren't shirt-rending fights. There were, however, many episodes, and I started writing them down at some point and then gave it up, where governments made interventions and created controversy by bringing, where you can see a scientific issue, an issue that looked purely scientific, was a third rail in some way that a lot of us didn't even understand until we were forced to think about it, that it would raise some concern to a country that had to then go back into the negotiations and worry that IPCC text would be thrown in their faces in order to say that what you're arguing for politically is either scientifically incorrect or incorrect. And the primary nexus for those issues were things that might have implications for aid or compensation to developing countries for damages eventually that are being done or will be done by emissions. Very difficult issue within the negotiations themselves. And when the negotiators, some of whom are the same people who attend both sets of meetings, come over to IPCC and look through their lens at all the scientific statements and see ones that could be trouble for them when they're thrown back in their faces later in a totally different venue like Paris, then you have real troubles in the scientific part or the IPCC discussions themselves. And that will only, inveiglements will, if that's a word, will only increase over time. As the states continue to increase, as the political decisions become more and more difficult, as the science moves further and further into the domain of the effects on human beings and the responses that human beings need to bring to the problem, we're going to see more and more of this complication. And I don't know where that leads, except that I know that more and more will probably lead to episodes like we've had in Working Group 3. But I think it's inevitable, and we have to figure out a way to work it out. Now, specifically with respect to Working Group 2, part of what we do in assessing the literature is objective and scientific in the sense that you think of, say, what Working Group 1 does. But part of it is explicitly, unabashedly, unashamedly value-laden. And we're quite upfront about that. And I'll just give you one example. These are the so-called reasons for concern. Working Group 2 deals with impacts and adaptation. And impacts and adaptation are interrelated concepts because unless you understand how people will adapt to the physical changes in the future, you can't understand what the impact is, because a high level of adaptation means lower impact, essentially, the trade-off. So you have to understand these concepts together. And there are so many impacts on humans at so many different scales, ranging from the global to the local to the individual, that first of all, the report has a problem. It's expanded to 30 chapters. I mean, it's now 2 volumes. It's sitting up on my desk, and I can't stand it because I'm not strong enough anymore to move it away from my desk. Get it on that high on the shelf. And so what we did is going back to the third assessment, that the idea was to aggregate the different risks associated with climate change into different categories. And these are the 5, and now this is now being expanded to 8. The first category basically has to do with unique and threatened systems. That doesn't mean just ecosystems, it means people dependent upon them. So you'll have good examples of coral reef system, very widespread in the tropics, but it's not just corals, it's the fish, it's not just the fish, it's the people who live off the fish. It's not just the people who live off the fish, it's the island economies dependent on them. It's not just that, it's the tourism that's brought in by the coral reefs. Same kind of story goes in the Arctic. You get very complex systems, and that bar is supposed to show you what the risk of climate change is as a function of temperature with either the left or the right axis, depending on whether you're interested in temperature against recent temperatures or pre-industrial. The second one are risks associated with extreme weather events, for instance, heat waves, which we just heard about, where the cost is enumerated in terms, for instance, of the number of people who might die in those heat waves. The third is the distribution of impacts. This is the hardest one to understand or explain. What it means is basically when the impacts of climate change when the impact or the risk is unevenly distributed, so that some parts of the world might be suffering, might be exposed to very large risks, while other parts are not. That difference in distribution of risk is what this bar is supposed to measure. The fourth one is aggregate impacts, which means the overall cost as measured by several metrics to the global economy as a whole. So that would be, one metric would be dollars, another could be biodiversity. And that's what that risk represents. And the fifth are the large-scale outcomes like the complete disintegration of an ice sheet or shutdown of the meridional overturning circulation of the Atlantic that are presumed to have large reverberations worldwide. And we were asked to make judgments about how fast the risk increases with temperature. And, you know, again, there's not only do you have to worry about scientific uncertainty when you do this, but you have to worry about the fact that you're talking about different kinds of systems which are aggregated together into one bundle, and therefore different metrics. Some systems you might measure by dollars and cents, some you might measure by lives lost, some you might measure by species lost, some you might measure by damage done to cultures, for instance. And these measures are, to some measure, they're incommensurate. You can't add them up together, but they are added up together. Somebody, me and others, made a judgment about how fast the risk increases with temperature. It's that kind of problem, one which crosses boundaries, intellectual boundaries, one which crosses scales, one which crosses cultures, that more and more gets to the heart of what IPCC is going to have to do. We've got this problem of talking about problems either at a very detailed level, where they play out on the ground for individuals, and where there's too much information almost, and you can't digest it, so you have to aggregate it in this way. And the aggregation itself has an arbitrary nature to it, obviously. Or you talk about things at a high level, where you've done an aggregation, this aggregation depends a lot on your personal judgments of the people who happen to be in the room, and you might get a different result if you had different experts. So, and yet there is no other way that we could think of at this point to try to represent the risk. Let me hit the other side. I got one slide. So don't buy, this is one of those idiotic slides that have more words on it than anybody could possibly read. The point is, just look at the left-hand column, which is Roman numeral 1 to 8. So we were asked to take every chapter, all of these 30 chapters were asked to give my chapter their favorite list of bad things that could happen, all the key risks. And then we aggregated these, because you had hundreds of them, and there is a table in the report which is many pages long, which has all of them. But nobody's going to read that, so we were asked to aggregate them, make decisions about the commonalities, make decisions about what's important. And so we had this list of aggregation, which is in the summary for policymakers, and the minute we did that, we got attacked for leaving out somebody's key risk. But those, again, those are the kind of decisions that have to be faced. So, in conclusion, I would say, number one, that the problem of expert judgment, which is largely subjective, is not one that's going to go away. And instead of trying to hide it and pretend that everything IPCC does is objective and you get the same result if you had a totally different cast of characters making the decisions, we ought to be explicit about it. And we ought to do what we can to sort of broaden the cast of characters that are making the judgments. Right now, the emphasis is on forming a robust consensus, but parts of the problem are not really subject to robust consensus in the sense that everybody does have the same view, no matter how expert they are. And we need to learn how to deal with that. We need to learn how to deal with the scale problem. The special report on climate extremes and disasters did a very good job of not only giving, that was a special report in the interim before the fifth assessment, but not only giving the high-level message about what's going to happen, but also having some case studies in the last chapter about how policymakers actually dealt with climate-related risk and climate-related disasters, and that sort of exploring what actually happens on the ground was very useful and made the report illustrative and tangible in a way that sometimes these reports aren't. And the third thing that I would say that we have to come to grips with somehow is the inevitable bias in these reports toward the peer-reviewed literature, which gets its due, but there's a lot of literature that isn't peer-reviewed, that's gray literature, that we do try to incorporate in some way or another, but inevitably is treated as if, and probably if because it is second-rate, but nevertheless, it represents, to a large extent, the contribution of people, largely in developing countries, but not entirely, who have a significant input to make in terms of the experience about things like adaptation on a problem that is going to affect mostly the 4/5 of humanity that doesn't deal with the peer-reviewed literature. And that's a problem that politically has gotten very, people have gotten exacerbated about it. The issue's gotten exacerbated. People have gotten upset about it recently, and there is no good solution at this point. So IPC is an ongoing project. It will hopefully change and be improved. As I think Marc pointed out, maybe Rob pointed out, it's not really likely to happen very fast because it's a big, slow-moving institution now. But it is an institution which is capable of changing, should change, and since the problem changes a lot very fast, IPCC is going to have to learn to change with it. Thank you.
So the floor is open for questions. We have about a half an hour. I guess I'll get my grip sheet and invite people to talk. We'll start with you back there, Lars.
Yes, and I think this question is to you, Ron.
You better ask real loud. You better also loud.
I think this question is to Ron, and this is about actually how objective the science is, or whether there's bias and whether it's been quantified. So, observational records, one would assume, have relatively low bias. But once you get into predictions and model projections, then all of a sudden there's a set of value components that you have to have. Some of them are scientific, and some maybe, or done by scientists, some maybe actually in a complex way between scientists and other groups. And I'm wondering, has anyone looked at the propensity for bias in the projections, and over time, whether there's a tendency to underpredict or overpredict? And in such case, what would be the likely reasons for moving one way versus the other?
So if I can take that question and then separate it into a component, let me label that understanding, which would be past to present climate, and then another component which is predictions and projections in the future. So, you know, one thing that's happened in the case of particularly the science, physical science part, is that the World Climate Research Program, which is an entity where under the World Meteorological Organization, has actually over the last 3 decades been conducting what has come to be known as MIPS, Model Intercomparison Projects. And these actually happen on a time scale which precedes slightly the IPCC time scale. So for example, AR6, Assessment Report 6, hasn't started yet, but the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project 6 has actually started already. And the idea is that the model intercomparisons actually help to understand differences between models, which kind of are some of the ways in which confidence levels are prepared in the IPCC. It doesn't go all the way because all the models have biases with respect to observations. So all the models are tested against existing observations. They have biases. But what you come up in the assessment process is a way to actually understand the reasons for outliers amongst the models and to hone in on those models which are actually doing the simulations according to Mother Nature, the best you understand it. And that kind of then goes into labeling it as the best understanding that we can get. That's actually in a better, slightly better state than the projections and predictions, because they're, when it comes to variables like global mean temperature, that's nailed by everyone. I mean, that's not much variability, because in a global mean, a lot of errors and biases in the various regions wash out. But what really gets to the crux of the problem is things like meridional overturning circulation in the Atlantic, or seasonality. And there you start seeing biases which are differences. They're not biases because you don't have the observations yet. But what happens in the assessment process is you make the best of the knowledge that you have based on deficiencies, known deficiencies in models, so you kind of maybe accord less weight to those models. And so you hope that what Michael said about expert judgment comes into play. For example, the slide that I had on the near-term projections, that final bar is actually not the mean of the models. It's actually expert judgment based on the fact that temperatures are slower, rising slower than the models, current models. So you bring the expert judgment, and hopefully that's a way of getting around, not completely away, but getting around model biases.
I'd like to have impose a little discipline on the questioning and go one report after another for at least a few minutes. So only questions on working group 1 and for Ram, to see if that works. Do you guys want to comment on this?
Yeah, comment.
First, we'll do that. Sure.
Working group 1, actually over time, the approach has matured and become more transparent in terms of this interface between what's quantifiable and relatively objective and what's expert judgment. And for the first time really in this assessment, there was a lot of explicit acknowledgement, particularly with the climate sensitivity analysis, of look, some of this is just our judgment. And although there's more to be done in that regard, I see the process as gradually moving to the point of being quite clear, and need to be clear about which part of this we think we're confident that if we took all the experts in the field, they would more or less agree on, and you get more or less the same answer, and which part of it may be, well, this is the way it looks today to these people who happen to be in this report. I think that's a massive step forward, frankly.
That was the hashed and dotted regions. So let's have a couple of questions and collect the questions before you answer them, Rob, okay? Suki Manabi.
Yeah.
Some of you know this gentleman did the very first estimates of the CO2 warming.
I was listening to this
Can you speak a little louder, Suki?
Discussion about particularly group 2. And the task of group 2 is to come up with how to adapt to the future change. But main emphasis of group is to predict what's going to happen in the ecosystem, what's going to happen in our economies. And these are, the harder we try to predict these things, the more we lose our credibility, because the discipline to predict these things are not at a stage to make any reliable predictions. And so that if the objective of group 2 is adaptation, what group 2 can do is to how to monitor the danger which you think is going to happen, and instead of predicting, try to propose how we should monitor, detect a change, so that we can adapt very effectively whatever going to happen. So that instead of trying to come up with prediction, everybody wants to have these predictions, which we can't do. So why don't we accept? We don't know. And instead of doing it, but we know the possibility of danger. So that what we can do reliably is to come up with proposal how to monitor nature. We have a satellite and global observational system now in place. and so that we can use these observations. How we can use these observations in order to detect, so that we can better predict the change, adapt to the change.
Can you park that question so we'll have it?
If I park it, I won't remember it. It was so complicated.
I'd like to go back.
Thank you, Suki. I'll get back to it.
I personally think there's a lot in that question that I'd love to have a chance to talk about. So back to group one. Yes, and then you, gentlemen, and then Ramana back there.
All of you, but especially Michael, referred to the fact that governments have attempted to pressure the science one way or another. Would it be appropriate to name which governments have been most interfering and which ones have been most supportive?
They all interfere at one time or another. Some of them are particularly egregious, but you know.
That's why I wanted to look particularly egregious.
It changes over time. You know, our government, the U.S. government, or at least my government, has behaved both terribly and very well, and sometimes at the same meeting. You know, the oil-producing states have generally behaved badly, but on the other hand, at the most recent meeting I was at, the Saudis, for instance, were real peacemakers in some way. They had an agenda and a reason for everything they did, but compared to some other countries, they behaved well. Then some countries where you think, you know, why do they bother? They have specific domestic reasons for making points, and they want to get them on record, and they can slow things and even stop things completely. So none of the governments are good. They're not good boys and girls. None of them.
I see. We're going to lose Harold Shapiro, who led a study of the IPCC. It was meant to inform and improve the quality of IPCC report number 5. Does this leave you with some thoughts?
Well, I have to confess I've not read the full volumes.
Come up to my office and I'll
I have read all the summary for policymakers, and as you all know, there's yet another summary, which is a summary of the summaries. And I did an interesting, perhaps misleading kind of study of that. I took a look at all the recommendations that made it to the summary document, the so-called synthesis. And I asked myself, of the roughly 30 or so, circa 30 recommendations, how many of those would be objected to by climate skeptics? And it turns out the vast majority of those observations and recommendations are quite acceptable to a climate skeptic. There's 4 or 5 central ones that would be very controversial. My only observation on that is it leads to a certain affect when you read these reports. The affect is very bland. And, you know, probably a lot of people in this room, including myself, I'm very worried about this. I'm all upset about what's going on. But if you read the synthesis report, say, all right, well, these are interesting observations. 25 out of the 30 are acceptable to a climate skeptic, and the others are not, of course. So I think that maybe it's a trivial observation, but it may explain why there's a certain amount of reservation about reacting to all this. In some sense, maybe that's a result of the negotiations, which are very central to this. I don't know. But that's and just compiling that list and saying which ones would a climate skeptic wrote was actually startling to me.
Interesting to ask the reverse
Not
question.
predicted that.
Ones that didn't get in, but that are in the long reports. How many of those are?
I haven't gone through that.
I mean,
That's not worth doing. I don't see that.
These gentlemen would know. Suppose you took the opposite as the 30 most controversial ones. What would that be? Harold, thank you for that. Okay, so Ramana and then loud, please.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of instances where working group 1 had specific governments for taking statements. And I'd like to know, I'm not going to ask for names, but I'd like to know a little bit about the form that the objection took. Was it a case of saying, look, this statement is just, prejudicial to our interest, or was it saying, look, we have our national lab and they have done their modeling and they say blah and you guys are saying X and these two go with it? Was it scientific?
The former.
Huh?
The former.
And back. Yes.
Yeah. my question actually follows up on his comment about the climate skeptics. Within the social sciences, there's a good 75 to 100 peer-reviewed empirical papers that tie barriers to climate change mitigation and adaptation, organized efforts from conservative foundations, think tanks, associated media, and how that flows through the whole system to actually stop politically this. And it's not just the United States, but it's a global phenomenon. And I'm just wondering, what can the IPCC do with that literature? Because when I look through the actual reports, there's really kind of no mention of organized efforts to derail climate change negotiations or to provide disinformation. But it's, I mean, we have a body of knowledge, and we know it, and there's consensus, and it's empirical. What are you going to do with that?
Question for Working Group 3. What are Working Group 3 operationalized in AR6? A review of the literature of the communication and of climate change and interventions in that communication. Just one or two questions more, and then we'll go back to the panel.
I'd like to address the question of the worth.
Loud.
Sorry. I'd like to address the question of the worth of values. In other words, what magnitude of physical change has to occur, do you think, before giving value, the worth of various values change? In other words, what is a war status?
Okay, one more? Or okay, Rob?
Michael brought up a slide that had on it apparently one of the columns that said dollars and cents, the cost of the impacts. But the whole document seems to have resisted comparing the cost to the economy of not doing stuff versus the cost to the economy of doing stuff. But it sounds like you're telling us, and despite my reading I didn't see it, that there's a column that we could actually make that comparison.
So other reports do, like the Stern report.
Yeah, no, but I was interested in this report because the cost is very clear in Working Group 3.
It's a long story there.
Well, perhaps you could tell us. Okay. So let's go through, starting with Rob, and go 1, 2, 3 in groups.
Okay. I thought Suki's question was addressed mostly to Working Group 2, but I'll take a stab at some thoughts that have occurred in terms of how to deal with the impacts from the scientific studies. So in other words, Working Group 1, 2 kind of things. And one of the things that has been pointed out is how this I mentioned the World Climate Research Program, which started as and is still a purely scientific entity, has actually been very important in I think bolstering the worth of the science and then that is assessed in Working Group 1. I think there's no question about it, because if you go back to Working Group 1, the chapters, and you see a lot of very important messages, they actually arise from all these inter-comparison studies which have happened before before the assessment happened. So a lot of us have been wondering whether something like that, what is called model inter-comparison projects, is something that Working Group 2 could consider. Not exactly the same way, but some similar style. So it brings together people, the groups working on this problem before even the IPCC assessment starts, and gives it a lot of time to gel and to work out things together, maybe in sort of an advanced move towards more robust writing. That's just a passing suggestion, because I think the question was mainly addressed to Michael. Governments interfering. Yeah, I mean, I could name a lot of governments on different points of view. The ones I had mentioned, the solar thing I mentioned was China and Saudi Arabia, and the other one, Ben Sanders thing, was actually a collection of delegations. But as Michael said, there are lots of instances where different governments really come at it from the point of view, because it hits vested interests, both their interests with other interests in terms of trade with other countries or domestic interests. So they pipe up. I mean, methane, when somebody starts talking about methane, New Zealand and Brazil, come to the fore, resisting sort of any notion about the global warming potentials of methane. And like that you can go on. I mean, in the United States and even UK kind of offer interventions which are sometimes you kind of raise your eyebrows and say, huh, how come you are raising these objections? Yeah, the bland SVMs, I think Harold brought this. Yeah, I guess I hadn't looked at the synthesis report in that fashion. That is worrisome if it is really bland. It's not intended to be that way. Certainly, the underlying technical reports don't really are not that bland. I mean, they are pretty emphatic, I think. Let's see. I think I exhausted. And I think that question about is it the objection to the government, is it based on their own work or just they don't like that language? I think it is they don't like the language because it then gets carried over. I think Rob or Marc mentioned the UNFCCC, and they're aware that this is the moment that they want to strike at it and not later on. So Rob, I think
good. We'll go right through to Michael next.
Okay, so on Suki, on your comment, Working Group 2 doesn't really, at this point at least, project. We use what Working Group 1 gives us as a basis for estimating impacts and how they may change in the future. I guess you could call that projection, but the strongest part of the projection is what we get from Working Group 1. But you're right, the fundamental chore is to decide how people and societies will adapt. Now, what you're really going to get annoyed about is that the next phase for Working Group 2 is actually, people are talking about it, actually trying to project the way social systems will change in the future, because as they change, the capacity to adapt will change, the vulnerabilities will change, the exposures will change, and we'll get into the whole business of actually taking Working Group 1's physical science projections and try to couple them with social science projections. No one knows if that can work out. They call them the shared socioeconomic pathways, and there are a lot of smart people working on them. I don't know whether it's a smart idea or not, but it's where the field is going. As far as the interesting question of cost-benefit comparison, so that's a Working Group 2, Working Group 3 issue. I'll let you talk about what Otmar had to say about that, which was quite a lot. But in Working Group 2, we estimated the damage costs. And the literature is quite sparse, actually, in terms of quantified in terms of dollars, cents, euros, whatever. And there's a lot of uncertainty, and there was a lot of controversy about it. And partly because of the uncertainty and the controversy around those estimates, we didn't make a big deal when, in the synthesis report, of trying to stick our numbers together with their numbers to have a marriage, which would be the cost-benefit analysis. And now you can maybe have a comment on what Otmar had to say about that.
Otmar being Otmar.
The head of Working Group 3, Otmar had to do it.
Aidan Ferkel will be here in April. Let me interject. I didn't introduce the series, only Marc did, but we are going to have several events, about 8, I guess. This is the first of 8, 4 of this at this level, and 4 somewhat more detailed this spring in the New Carbon Futures Initiative. It has a website. You can find the announcements there. It's underneath it. It's inside the Princeton Environment Institute website. And we want more people to participate and, in fact, take some leadership roles. So if you find this interesting, let us know. Marc, Working Group 3 perspective on the questions just asked.
Yeah, so I won't speak for Otmar at the offer. So he will come here and he will talk about his perception of his views on the IPCC process and how to think about AR6. Let me react on 2 issues. So the Harold Socolow's point is, I think, is well taken. A report that is negotiated is always bland compared to the underlying document, and so people can always go back to the full report or to the technical summary. There is a technical summary, perhaps that should be advertised more, because it's something that is relatively accessible, not heavy to carry, and is essentially highlighting the main points and the key messages of the big report. Nevertheless, I think that the synthesis, the summary for policymakers are not completely bland, and some key messages, perhaps it's in a statistic of a number of messages, it's just 4 or 5, but I think it was quite clearly conveyed, for instance, that we have a window of opportunity for action that is slowly closing. And that if we continue to wait for a few more decades, then we'll have a serious problem. So much so that if we want to really avoid big consequences, we'll have to hope for inventing technologies that will reduce, that will produce negative emissions, so to speak. Now, my personal worry about the process is that perhaps one thing that could be improved is that the governments have a veto power in the approval session for each sentence of the summary for policymakers. And it's not clear that the veto power is really completely justified. So I just want to throw that. We could very well imagine that something a bit less radical than a veto power could operate. And there were discussions in the approval session where it was clear that the objections came from a very, very small minority of the delegates. And in such a situation, it's not obvious that the minority should carry the decision. So that's one issue. Now, the related question was about the obstacles and the forces that try to stop any action against climate change. It's not true, actually, that the report doesn't say anything about that. And in fact, in the framing chapters of Working Group 3, including my chapter on sustainable development, we had some political economy sections that describe the forces, the positive and negative forces for action. And the notion, the expression vested interest found its way in several places in the report. Now, the reason why this is not highlighted as much as you might want is, I guess, simply the role of the report. The report is supposed to give advice to governments who are asking questions. And so the report is really geared toward giving the best knowledge we have about what is relevant for governments. And it's not about telling governments, don't listen to certain people because these are bad guys, right? This is not exactly the question they ask. The question they ask is what should be done, or what, not exactly what should be done, because we are not really giving exact advice. But nevertheless, it's more about giving us the material to make the good decision. The other point on which I just wanted briefly to say something is about the cost-benefit analysis, and indeed this difficulty between Working Group 2 and 3. So it was a bit frustrating in a way because we were able to explain in quite a lot of detail the methodology that should be used for the evaluation of the optimal amount of effort, and we were unable to implement it. And so, in a way, the report at that point was a sort of call for better data, and especially regarding the quantitative evaluation of damages, so that through cost-benefit analysis could be done later on. But that was more or less the.
I also did. There was an element of it which was really both the cost and the benefit, the mitigation side and the damage side. Both are permeated to some extent by these value questions. Certainly the damage side, how do you quantify a loss of a culture? So there's a reluctance to want to put the two sets of numbers together. And then on the mitigation, the emissions reduction side, there were big questions that Otmar kept bringing up about, well, sure, we could do biofuels, but then the land transformation implications are so monumental. You're talking about such a different world that you can't really, representing that by one cost number is ridiculous. And so there were a number of questions which were meta to everything else that just everybody then backed off. And although in some sense you'd like that comparison, in another it seemed dishonest to a lot of people.
I'm going to ask a pair of questions. The first is that I believe it would be helpful to hear your thoughts on one of the accomplishments, objectives even, of the IPCC, which is to globalize the conversation, but at the level of expertise, develop capacity to deal with the science, the impacts, and the responses in the developing world. Co-chairs deliberately chosen from one from the developing, one from the developed world, and so forth. Is that working anywhere near to the extent that it was intended to? Are there schemes for making it more effective? is it one of the major achievements of the IPCC? And then the second question is for my own hobby horse, which is that, and it was implicit in Suki Manabe's question, there has been a resistance to making the IPCC process, or a process especially about risk and extremes of risk, working from the tails toward the median, toward the mean rather than the mean toward the tails, to try to understand as early as we can whether something really disastrous could happen, which is consistent with the science, these positive feedbacks that one can write down. So is it plausible that the IPCC will evolve toward a more risk-based operation instead of the one that today is primarily occupied with describing what, confirming that we're doing something dangerous to the planet? And we'll go 1, 2, 3 again.
On your first question of the developing the capacity around the world, I think it has been a huge success. From the point of view of working with one, certainly, and watching the various assessments, between the first and the assessment, there's been a surge in participation by not only at the government levels and engaging, but also the governments in training people in their own countries to engage in the IPCC process. And IPCC has encouraged this by, of course, drafting in people directly as lead authors, coordinating lead authors in some cases, heading world chapters, and also review editors. So it has succeeded. I think there's a lot of activity, and in fact, one of the kind of side benefits or side challenges is the number of models, climate models that have come up around the world, because now every country wants to do their own climate model calculations, and they can afford it. A lot of countries can afford it. So I think there's been a surge, and I think this has definitely helped in one particular point, and that point being that the things that they care about, the things that countries care about, be they small countries economies in transition, or purely developing countries, they have caught on to the climate change message. And of course, increasingly, some of them are seeing extremes in their own neighborhoods. So it's kind of actually galvanized, I would say, the world community, the world governments into action. In fact, some governments actually are proposing to do their own climate assessment before AR6, so that AR6 can actually refer to their own to their internal assessments. On the second point on the risk, again, my kind of thing is limited to working with one, but risk is something that should come in, I think, at some point. How it comes in is really has to be a working group two, at least a working group 2 and 1 conversation, if not 3, 2 and 1. And it's not entirely clear that should this be something that occurs under IPCC umbrella entirely, because remember, IPCC, the whole concept is based on assessing literature. And if this is something that has to be done in a more proactive fashion outside of literature, IPCC may not be the body to do it.
So the Working Group 2 report is now framed largely in terms of risk. That's if you read it, we intentionally reframed the report as much as possible to present the problem in terms of risk. What you're asking a deeper question, which is if you want to do risk fully, you have to talk about the parts of the problem that are hard to get a handle on, that are hard to probabilize, the tails, for instance, as you mentioned. Working Group 1 has been moving, in my view, and you don't mind me speaking from the outside a little bit, in the right direction in that regard, too slowly in my view, but getting there. And once we have a sort of more complete working representation of the physical science, that's in terms of complete distributions, not just model-based, but including a broader representation of the ambiguities in the problem, for instance, then a more complete risk distribution can be given. And of course, eventually, to be integrated, has to include the perspective of Working Group 3. And, it's inching in that direction. By the way, if there are going to be more assessments and governments doing their own assessments, nobody's going to be doing any research. So all we're going to be doing is assessing each other.
Smart assessments.
Yeah, so I fully agree that the risk is now becoming quite important also in working group 3. There was a whole chapter on how to deal with risk, what are the decision-making procedures and methods. Of course, things can be improved in terms of quantifying risk and trying to be more specific about things that are very hard to quantify. But there has been also a special report on extreme events, which was assigned the main report. So I think that really this issue is really on the agenda. About the global conversation, so on the face of it, it looks like the IPCC is very successful indeed, because there is a broad participation of many countries and among the authors and among the delegates. I must confess that I was a bit shocked by certain things I've seen, which reflected a kind of inequality between authors coming from different countries in the weight they had in the proceedings at various stages. And so some improvement can be done, but that probably has to do more with the persons in charge of it. I mean, it's really a matter of goodwill of people involved more than procedures or rules, I guess.
I did want to stop at 6. One person is indicating a burning question. Let's let that happen, and then we'll take
This has been a very interesting session about politics with no political science contributing. And there's some, Marc gave it away a minute ago where he said, the SPM is advice to governments. Oh no, it's not advice to governments. He's right the second time, it's not advice to governments. It portrays itself that way. Governments take advice from agents whom they think share their interests. This is not the case at your value level IPCC. You aren't kidding governments. You are providing background knowledge to the attentive public. Well,
to the what public? We can't.
The attentive public. People pay attention. The press, the
Attentive
media, the attentive public. You provide background knowledge to them. And that's what you're doing, not advising governments. In that light, the fuss about the SPM being edited so heavily by government has a different tone, because you have to ask yourself, what are you assuming about the audience you're speaking to? If they're very naive and unitary, then of course they can be fooled easily by a new SPM. They only look at the SPM, they don't realize that it's been edited by governments, and they pay attention to it. But if they behave like any political actor can normally behave, who pay attention, they will not regard it as fully credible if they realize it's being edited by governments. And essentially the SPM is playing the role of a broker between the technical work that you all do and the public knowledge. If that broker is less credible, other brokers will appear. So what will happen is the SPM won't be as important. And there's been a lot of stress out here on the SPM being downgraded, assuming that somehow people will still pay attention to it. They won't necessarily do so if it's not credible.
Quick responses, and then we'll stop.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks. And I use the word advice, but that's not really what I wanted to say. But still, the target audience is really government, because the governments are those who ask questions. So essentially, the exercise of the report is answering questions raised by governments, and that's the way things are presented to the authors. We don't choose the questions, we don't choose even the structure of the bullet points of the chapters. We have these points to address, and that comes from an earlier process in which the governments are heavily involved. And that makes sense, right? Because they want to get the answers on certain issues, and that's our mandate. So it's not, the word advice was wrongly chosen, but nevertheless, it's not as if we were just targeting the general public. It's really, the job is to answer questions by certain policymakers.
And I would say that, the advice is not a well-chosen word, but I think the function of IPCC is that all the governments have it as a reference point. So they don't really have to argue about the details of the science. Whether they all agree with everything in the document or not, they all seem to see that the existence of the report means they don't have to argue. So let's move on to other things. Now, the governments use surrogates to do the argument for them. Part of the stuff that goes on in the United States with the argument about the science, part of that is aided and abetted by certain elements in the government. We have a complicated government that way that is 8 different things going on at once. And so it's not that simple, but I see the major function of IPCC being that people who advise decision makers can turn around and sort of all say, all right, we're gonna start with this basis, and then we can disagree about what proceeds from that.
Okay.
Can I just,
yes.
The IPCC, my impression is it is a response to questions, but the questions themselves are framed by a conglomerate of the governments and the scientists. The people who gather to draft the questions are essentially a mix of scientists and other, not just scientists in physical science, but scientists in other disciplines, as well as governments themselves, because the governments have to approve the question before the IPCC starts. So in a way, it's a response, but I think the time scale is so long that it kind of morphs into more than just a response. It morphs into something else as well.
You can ask yourself the counterfactual: what would happen if IPCC weren't there? Political scientists love counterfactual. So what would happen? The reason they put IPCC together is they were competing groups of scientists shouting different messages. And it was annoying the governments to have to hear that. So this is a better outcome.
I'm thinking, though, with a worry that whether the scientists, if they didn't have the government sharing the agenda setting, that they would come up with questions they regard as more important. They can take the government to pay attention. I'll leave that.
Thank you.
What's interesting
I got a message too. Step out.